Well, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the latest in RUSI's military history program. I'm Siddharth Kaushal. I'm the fellow here at the military sciences team the fellow for CPOW here at the military sciences team at RUSI. And it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Andrew Lambert, who will be described from King's College London, who will be discussing with us the Royal Navy's roles during the Crimean War. It's often there's often an imagined history of military events which centers around battles, the siege of Sevastopol and the battles that surrounded it in Crimea, for example. But it's easy to forget some of the quieter but perhaps more consequential elements of military history. In this case, the fact that the Crimean War and the events on the peninsula were nested within a global maritime war that was multi-theater in scope and arguably just as consequential, if not more, to the war's outcome and strategic outcomes after it than anything that happened on the peninsula. Our guest today is particularly well suited to describe both the maritime dimensions of the war and the lessons it carries for future strategists. Professor Lambert is the Lawton Professor of Naval History at the War Studies Department at King's College London. He's also the director of the Lawton Center in Naval History. His research emphasizes the naval, strategic, and cultural dimensions of the British Empire, from the Napoleonic War to the First World War, the evolution of naval strategic thinking, and the evolution of technology. He's a widely published and widely read author, among most widely read in his field, and perhaps the most pertinent of his works to today's discussion was his work on British grand strategy during the Crimean War, which both reframed the conflict and set it within its global context. So first of all, Andrew, thank you very much for being with us today. Before I turn over to our speaker for his opening remarks, I would just like to remind everyone that both the opening remarks and the subsequent Q&A will be on the record. I'd also direct your attention to the Q&A function, which is in the center of your screens. Please feel free to put any questions you have to the speaker in that box at any time during the discussion, and I'd be happy to collate them for the Q&A section once we get to that point. And with that, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sid. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I trust everyone has a rather explosive picture in front of them and that the show is ready to go. What I want to talk about is not the Crimean War that's memorialized little more than 100 yards from the current residence of the RUSI, just opposite Waterloo Place, but the real Crimean War, the Crimean War that Britain won, and which inflicted a massive strategic defeat on Imperial Russia. This is a war determined by naval power, not just the obvious contest of navies against navy, because the Russians didn't come out and offer battle. They abandoned the sea to the British and the French, but the way in which the British used naval power to stretch around the globe, to crush Russia's ability to operate at sea, and ultimately to crush the Russian economy. This war would be resolved by economic pressure, not by military action. If anyone thinks that taking a small port city several thousand miles away from St. Petersburg is going to win a war, they seriously misunderestimated the Russians. So this is the geography of what we're familiar with as the Crimean War: Black Sea, southern Russia.
Professor, sorry to interrupt. I'm just wondering, we can't see your PowerPoint slides.
Oh, that is very strange. Right. Well, yeah.
Thank you.
Let me go back and see if we can share screen. Right. Is that correct?
Yes, we can see it now. Thank you.
Excellent. Right. Well, it was showing well on my screen, but that doesn't really matter. I'm familiar with these. So to simply recap, here's a spectacular image of the Royal Navy in action, but it's not anywhere near the Crimea, and it's not a battle anybody's heard of because nobody on the British side got killed. And I will proceed. This is where everybody thinks the Crimean War happened, in the Black Sea, somewhere between Sevastopol and Istanbul, and it involved a large amount of suffering by the British and French armies, much more suffering by the Russians, and it ended after a series of battles and a great siege, being overtaken as a news event by the development of modern nursing by Florence Nightingale. Now, all of that is, of course, untrue. The war was reported in many ways, but not many of them were particularly accurate. So we have a very strange view of the war in which the actions on land and some medical attention has overtaken the reality of the conflict. Keep that map in mind, because it is the map of one of the major theatres of the war, but it is not the major theatre, and the Crimea and Sevastopol are not the primary focus of British attention in this conflict. This conflict occurred at the end of a 40-year period of fairly hostile relations between Britain and Russia, what we might call a 19th century Cold War. The two great global empires of the early 19th century, Russia, much as it is today, a large land empire dominated by autocratic regimes and military power. Britain, an expansive maritime economic empire, which stretched around the globe. And these two empires have been struggling over control of Ottoman Turkey, particularly for economic reasons, and parts of Central Asia. So this was a war that had been brewing for some time. And so when it broke out, it was not a great surprise to either side. The only novelty was that the French were involved, and they were now the allies of the British. The first significant naval action of the war was a Russian attack on a Turkish squadron in the harbour at Sinope, which is halfway along the southern coast of the Black Sea. This squadron was carrying supplies and stores to the Turkish army in the Caucasus, and the Russians sent a large battle fleet to intercept and destroy it, which they did with considerable ease. They comprehensively overpowered the Turks and destroyed their ships. One small steamship got away. This was seen in Britain as a profound insult, because Britannia was clearly the master of all the waves, and therefore for the Russians to even appear on the sea was somehow an insult. And the popular press went into overdrive. But the war would not be declared following this incident. It would be declared towards the end of March in the following year. And the reason for that was, here we see the Russian fleet in Sevastopol in better times, just before the war. The Russian fleet was built up under Tsar Nicholas I, who, as it happens, is Vladimir Putin's favorite Tsar. And it was a powerful force capable of transporting a large army from Sevastopol and Odessa down to the Bosphorus to seize and hold Istanbul. This was, as the First Lord of the Admiralty of the time said, the eye tooth of the bear. This was Russia's ability to grab Turkey quickly before Britain or France could ascend the Dardanelles and come to reinforce Turkish defenses. This was why in this theatre, Sevastopol was such a high priority. But Sevastopol was not the decisive issue for the British. The decisive issue would be in the Baltic. The capital of Russia was, in those days, St. Petersburg. And you can tell my map is an old one because it also mentions the name Leningrad. Between 1815 and 1854, the Baltic was largely a Russian lake. The Russians dominated Finland, the Baltic states, which were part of their territory, much of Poland, and they exercised a powerful influence over Sweden and Denmark, which essentially left them neutralized and weak in the face of Russian pressure. Russia's major fleet is in the Baltic, as well as its major trading outlets. So the Baltic is critical, and the determination of the British to declare war focused on the end of March, when the Baltic sea ice begins to retreat towards the east, opening up the Russian naval base at Reval, or Tallinn as it is today, which the British intended to attack in a preemptive strike to weaken the Russian battle fleet. The inspiration for this was Nelson's idea after his battle at Copenhagen in 1801. As it turned out, the Russians had also read Lives of Nelson and didn't leave their battle squadron at Reval. They retreated back to Kronstadt outside St. Petersburg. But taking control of the Baltic determined the date on which the war began, not anything to do with the Black Sea. The appointed commander-in-chief was Admiral Sir Charles Napier, at that stage the leading Liberal naval officer, and it was both his naval abilities and his liberal politics that were seen as a threat to Russia. Russia, autocratic, conservative regime challenged by steam-powered battleships and high-powered radical liberal agendas. Napier had been a member of parliament in the radical interests in the previous decade. And his flagship was the world's largest battleship, HMS Duke of Wellington, 131-gun steam-powered battleship, more than twice the size of Nelson's Victory. This was a big statement of technological dominance. Nobody else had ships quite like this, and certainly the Russians did not. They were behind in the naval technological race. Their fleet was largely composed of sailing ships. Napier moved into the Baltic without any particular problem. He rendezvoused with the French, seen here in a contemporary lithograph, British and French ships saluting, and then proceeded into the Gulf of Finland to check out Russia's great fortresses and to begin the question of economic warfare. He was unable to impose effective economic warfare in 1854 because the British government recognized that all Russian exports, and this blockade would be choking off Russian exports, were all prepaid for the year before. So blockading Russia in 1854 would have denied British consumers goods that they'd already paid for from Russia. Therefore, it was decided to have something of a paper blockade in 1854 and to impose a full blockade in 1855, having warned everyone not to buy any Russian goods in 1854. This meant the fleet was left for an offensive operation, looking for somewhere to attack. And eventually they attacked the Åland Islands, which are between the southwestern coast of Finland and the Stockholm archipelago. This was the outermost work of the Russian Empire. And in August 1854, an Anglo-French fleet landed 10,000 French troops, some British Royal Marines and naval personnel, captured and destroyed naval base and fortresses that protected a very large anchorage, which the Russians had been developing as their observation post in the central Baltic and a means of controlling Sweden. This was Britain's first victory in the Crimean War, and it was nowhere near the Crimea. But it was not much of a victory as far as the public was concerned, because hardly anybody got killed, and the few people who died of disease happened to be French. So the battle was not reported, despite being a major strategic success. Here is Sir Charles Napier in his straw hat watching a long-range bombardment of the fortress of Bombasund. The gun being used is a 68-pounder smoothbore, and they're firing at a range of well over 3,300 yards. This long-range fire had been developed specifically to bombard hostile shore facilities during the 1830s and 40s. The Royal Navy anticipated dominating the sea and needing to bombard from range to achieve strategic effect. So Napier is watching while a team of skilled naval ratings are operating the gun under the direction of a trained gunnery officer. The fortress of Bombasund was captured, the Russians were taken away as prisoners of war, and the entire fortress was razed to the ground by Royal Engineers. This is British strategy in action: seize the enemy's bases, sink their ships, blow up their fortresses, and if it's a large dockyard, destroy their dry docks as well. From that point on, command of the sea is absolute, and you can begin to take liberties with the enemy. Napier eventually had to come home in November because the Baltic freezes over, and he was scapegoated for not doing more than was humanly possible by a rather embarrassed government. In the meantime, the British and French armies had moved from Bulgaria into the Crimea, as you can see on this Russian language schematic, and had fought a series of battles and had arrived just to the south of Sevastopol. Let me be clear, the operation in the Crimea was not an invasion, it was a grand raid. Its objective was to seize and destroy the Russian fleet and naval base, and the intended duration of the operation was 12 weeks, which explains why they didn't have any winter clothing. The operation was intended to be finished well before the winter. The failure of the operation compromised the entire plan and led many to think the plan had been faulty. It was not. was the execution that let the plan down. On the 17th of October 1854, a month before winter even began to appear, a grand attack was made on Sevastopol by land and sea, which was intended to capture the city. The attack failed because the French batteries that were meant to allow French infantry to assault the position were destroyed by Russian counter-battery fire before they even opened on the morning of the bombardment. The British general was ready to assault. His guns had knocked down the Russian works, but he couldn't find the French general to coordinate an altered plan. The French were so embarrassed by their failure, they didn't want the British to take the city on their own. The naval attack was largely diversionary. There was no way into the harbour because the Russians had scuttled their battle fleet in the entrance to the harbour to prevent Royal Navy steamships from going into the harbour and attacking the defences in reverse. So the Russians had surrendered their fleet, they had thrown their sailors ashore and turned them into infantrymen, and they were using their naval guns to defend the fortress. They would fight for another 12 months. This bitter, long drawn-out fight would eat its way through large numbers of Russian soldiers and quite a few British and French as well. But almost all of those casualties were disease, hypothermia, malnutrition, rather than combat. This was one of those wars where you were far more likely to die of anything but gunshot injuries. This sets up what we know as the siege of Sevastopol. It's not, in fact, a siege. The Russians have access to the city from the north of Sevastopol harbor, so they were never cut off. Their logistics remained effective until the middle of the following year. British supplies through Balaclava had to go up a 10-mile muddy track, which caused problems until a railway was laid. How did the railway, the troops and the supplies get there? By sea, of course, all convoyed or escorted as necessary by the Royal Navy. The French were operating out of a different base and doing much the same. This was a maritime amphibious raid operation. It was not a continental campaign. The critical point of the whole operation is pretty much in the center of this picture. It's the Russian dockyard. It's on the creek just below the word Grande Rade, or if you go under the R, you'll see some docks, 6 very large, brand new dry docks to service the Russian fleet, recently built by British engineers. That is a target of the operation. In May 1855, an Anglo-French and Turkish force captured Kerch, opening up the Sea of Azov. This was a brilliant operation, hardly any casualties, using overwhelming maritime amphibious force. Within a matter of days, British gunboat flotillas were ranging around the Sea of Azov, destroying Russian logistics, and that did include capturing the city of Mariupol, which then as now was a critical logistics hub linking up southern Russia with the Crimea. Here we see Royal Navy ratings on a made-up shallow draft platform using heavy artillery to destroy key elements of Russia's resource base. That will be fodder for the Russian horses, grain, wheat, fish, ammunition, and everything else that the army in the Crimea needs. This campaign led to the fall of Sevastopol. If you want naval influence on military operations, this is it. A campaign in which hardly a single sailor was killed in action led to the fall of a large Russian city that had defied 2 big armies for 12 months. Logistics were the key. The Navy was also involved in bombarding Sevastopol, leading to the fall of the city on the 9th of September 1855. The French actually captured the critical bastion, the Malakoff. Here we see the French waving the tricolor. The British Army didn't capture their bastion, so the honours of the day went to the French. At this point, the French lost interest in the war. They were really only fighting for glory in order to recover their reputation as Europe's leading army. And having beaten the Russians, they'd gained some revenge for Borodino, and they could go home, which they began to do fairly swiftly. The British had other agendas. They wished to weaken Russia permanently, and that meant more pressure in different theaters. This is the Grand Russian diorama reflecting what life was like inside the fortress under heavy bombardment. It's a masterpiece of Russian realism. And here is the evacuation of Sevastopol. A bridge of boats was built from the city across to the north side of the harbor. The fleet was scuttled, and everything of value in the city was set fire to and destroyed. The Russians had lost Sevastopol after a heroic defense, which has written it into the history of Russia, which makes it a very special place in the Russian memory. Within little more than a month, newfangled armored warships were in action against the fortress at Crimean, which is on the western side of the Crimean Peninsula, covering the confluence of the Bug and Dnieper rivers and leading up to the shipyard, which is currently under attack at Mykolaiv, or Nikolaev as it was when it was under Russian control. This was the first use of armor-plated warships in combat in world history. It was certainly not something that happened in the American Civil War. That was a very different thing. British and French got there rather sooner. This is about power projection, and it's about denying the enemy strategic resource. The last campaign in the Black Sea before the end of 1855 was the Russian capture of the fortress city of Kars, which meant the Russians actually won the last battle of the Crimean War. Not that it did them much good. Because there were other campaigns. There was a major campaign in the White Sea, attacking what is now Murmansk and Archangel, with British squadrons looking to sail into Archangel and destroy the naval base and shipyard there. They were unable to do so. The ships that were sent were too deep draft, but they did dominate the sea area and ended up engaged in a fairly serious gun battle with a Russian monastery. Never underestimate how belligerent Russian Orthodox monks are. They have their own cannon and they're happy to use them. This caused some humor in the London newspapers. It was somewhat amused to think of the Royal Navy fighting a battle with monks, but the monks had their own infantry and artillery and were well prepared for this action. The blockade in the White Sea stopped the Russians exporting large quantities of grain, timber, iron, and other northern products, and was part of the blockade, eventually broke the Russian economy. But again, it was a blockade that takes effect in 1855 because of the peculiar nature of Russian trade. There was a naval battle in the far Pacific at what is now Petropavlovsk, a Russian naval base there with some frigates in it. The British and French attacked and made a bit of a mess of things in 1854. This was not one of the Royal Navy's best days. But eventually the Russians abandoned the position and destroyed their ships, and they were driven away from the coast. We now return to the Baltic in 1855. Here we see the two hydrographic survey vessels, Merlin and Firefly, running into the world's first large minefield. They both hit mines, but fortunately the mines are quite small and not going to sink a ship. But they're right in the approaches to the great Russian fortress at Kronstadt, which guards the approach to St. Petersburg. What are they doing? They're preparing for an assault operation of long-range bombardment to destroy the dockyard and the fortress. So they're going into harm's way to prepare for a major naval operation that will bring the war to a conclusion. Placing a strategic risk on St. Petersburg is going to focus Russian attention really quite powerfully. Here is St. Petersburg and Kronstadt. This is a modern map. The causeways linking the island of Kronstadt with the mainland didn't then exist, but all the traffic for deep water vessels goes between the island of Kronstadt and the southern shore of the Gulf of Finland. It's a very narrow navigable passage commanded by the world's largest naval fortress. This was an enormously impressive work dated back to Peter the Great, but had been added to many, many times since. But the Royal Navy was perfectly confident they could take it on and destroy it. All they needed were enough gunboats and mortar vessels. And here we see a sketch from one of the British officers on those survey ships. This is what the Russian defenses looked like. 2- and 3-decked fortresses, battleships, and most of the smoke is being generated by furnaces that are heating red-hot shot, ready to fire at the wooden warships, should they have the temerity to attack. So this is a bit of action reporting. by one of the many skilled naval observers. This was a serious plan, and it was intended to conduct it in 1856. Instead, in the absence of the full requirement of gunboats, mortar vessels, and ironclads, the Navy's attention focused on Sveaborg, the Swedish-built fortress on the outskirts of Helsinki. Finland was then a Grand Duchy of Russia, and this was a Russian fortress and naval base. The open sea is to the left of this picture. Helsinki Harbour is to the right. Very narrow entrance. So what are the British doing here? Well, this is a base for Russian gunboats. It's a base for Russian warships. And if it can be destroyed, this will allow the Navy to concentrate at the very eastern end of the Gulf of Finland for the grand attack on Sevastopol, on Kronstadt. In early August 1855, a 2.5-day continuous bombardment, night and day, using heavy artillery, mortars, rockets, and some new rifled artillery pieces, not only bombarded the fortress, but burnt the gunboat sheds and the gunboat fleet, set off one of the main magazines, and left the dockyard and arsenal completely ruined. Not a single Allied sailor was killed in this operation. So it was not reported particularly enthusiastically by the London press, which tended to measure consequence with cost. The cost was gunpowder, munitions, and weapons. It was not lives. This picture was created by one of the artists who was on the spot. It compresses the action, but it certainly gives a sense of the sheer scale of the operation. And this was only 20% of the effort that was being intended, the great attack on Kronstadt, which would have finished the war. This is what the attack on Sevastopol is all about. These are the 6 great dry docks that have been built by British engineers, and just behind them you can see Fort Nicholas and the defences of Sevastopol harbour. So this is what the whole campaign is about: 6 holes in the ground in which you can mend ships. Having captured the city, the British ransacked it, but they spent more of their time in the dry docks, where the Royal Engineers carried out a 3-month-long demolition operation to completely destroy every last vestige of Russian naval infrastructure. This picture by William Simpson is important not for showing us the docks, but for showing us some French officers curiously watching what the British are doing. Their curiosity would have been piqued by the fact that these strategic ideas had been developed not to attack Russia, but to attack France. The target of all of this long-range artillery, amphibious power projection, and explosive work was the French naval base at Cherbourg, which had just been completed. The British needed to take out Cherbourg in order to secure command of the sea in the Channel and the Western approaches, and that would have been the first operation of war in an Anglo-French conflict. So these men with goatee beards wearing kepis are looking at how the crazy British are planning to take out a French naval base. And this is very important going forward. This strategy was applicable to the French, the Russians, the Americans, and anybody else who had a navy and threatened to be awkward. It was the basis of British strategy for global security. And it was the means by which an economic blockade could be imposed. So in 1855, the blockade of Russia was very effective. It was run through the City of London. It was largely coordinated by the government, Lloyd's of London, and the other major bureaus in the city. It meant that Russia could not export grain, timber, forest products of any description. And by December 1855, Russia was bankrupt, literally functionally bankrupt, unable to pay its soldiers, to pay its bills. Bread riots were spreading, and so were recruitment riots. There was a serious threat to the stability of the Russian Empire. And empires, unlike nation states, do have a stability issue when they're under pressure. People start to move away from the center and think about recovering their own separate national identities. It would not do for Russia to be in this condition and then to have St. Petersburg burnt to the ground by the Royal Navy. So in December 1855, the Tsar and his ministers agreed to surrender. less than a week after the British had given a security guarantee to Sweden, one which looks an awful lot like the one that was issued by the British government very recently to Sweden. So history does repeat itself, and there is a rhyme to it and a reason. The Great Armada that was built to tackle Kronstadt and bombard St. Petersburg was used for the victory parade at the end of the war. At Spithead on St. George's Day, 1856, that's April 23rd, a moving pageant of gunfire carried out a mock attack on Southsea Castle to demonstrate precisely what the British intended to do. The audience included the Queen, the Prince Consort, members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and the entire diplomatic corps from the Court of St. James, who were invited along to see what the British would do to them if they got in the way and caused any serious trouble. This was the victory parade. There was no victory parade for the army. They hadn't actually won the war. The Navy won the war, and they had the victory parade. This was the first great steam-powered naval review of the era, and it was a monumental demonstration of national industrial mobilization and military power. 5 years after this, Britain and the Union government came very close to war when the Americans broke international maritime law. The Americans backed down in this crisis when the president, Abraham Lincoln, was informed that the British were mobilizing the gunboat fleet, which had been laid up at Haslar across the previous 5 years, and had put the dockyard workers on double time to do so. So this did have a real impact. And for the rest of the 19th century, whenever Britain and Russia were in crisis, often about Turkey or Afghanistan, the mobilization of a Baltic fleet at Portsmouth was enough to stop Russia's activity and reverse the tendency to expand across other people's territory. This really did matter. This was how Britain avoided any future wars with Russia for the next 50 years, and it was hugely significant. So why is it then that we remember the Crimean War for the heroics of guardsmen and the capture of a city that was actually taken by the French? The picture on the right shows a British ADC reporting to the French officer who's just put his flag up on the Malakoff Bastion. If you want to win the campaign in the Crimea, you need 200,000 French soldiers, which the British didn't have. If you want to win the war, you need the Royal Navy to break the Russian economy and put Russia's capital city under threat. And that is how the Crimean War was won. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that, Andrew. I think we've covered a lot of ground there, from the value of horizontal escalation to the impact of the quieter but arguably more strategically important economic elements of war. So please feel free to put your questions into Andrew in the Q&A box. But if I could start off with a question of my own, Andrew, in terms of, the British emphasis on destroying in a fundamental way the sources of Russian maritime power, its capacity to threaten Britain's freedom of the seas, was that threat real or imagined, in your opinion? Was Russia, a continental power with a series of commitments and a sclerotic economy, ever really going to be capable of challenging Britain on the seas, or was this more of a strategic sort of nightmare that perhaps was exaggerated in the minds of policy?
Right. Thank you very much for that question. Russia has real problems generating naval power. They're technological problems, many of which we can see in Russia today. They don't have the facilities to build some of the cutting-edge weapon systems they would like to have. And of course, the main focus of Russian security has to be continental. This is a continental empire today as it was then. And as a result, the security considerations on land always take precedent under pressure. We see that in Russia's major wars of the 20th century. The Navy simply gets put to one side, and basically the naval side of the war is left to allies. Russia is putting all of its effort on land. The problem for Britain was, of course, that it didn't have an army that could force Russia to commit itself in a large way militarily. And the Russians were applying pressure in areas where it would be possible for their army to secure an advantage. The Turkish Narrows is an obvious one. The Russians got all the way to Adrianople in 1829 and threatened to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. The British had to find a way of countering that, and that meant being much more dynamic, particularly pressing into the Baltic. So instead of meeting the Russians with a small army outside Adrianople, they would meet the Russians outside St. Petersburg with a large fleet. And they put a huge diplomatic effort into securing access to the Baltic, which up to that time was in doubt. Was it possible for British warships to pass through the Danish Narrows without violating international law? So there's a major legal question, there's a major strategic question, there's a major navigational question. So British charting of the Baltic is critical. When they go to war in 1854, the British have all the charts they need to attack into Russia's coastal waters. That isn't accidental, that's very deliberate. So these are asymmetric powers. Their strengths and weaknesses are exactly the opposite of each other. And it's finding a place they can engage strategically. And for the British, they have the naval power to stop the Russians attacking them. But they do have to be very careful where they land their troops on the Russian coast, because the Russians do have enormous military resources. So taking the French along to the Crimea proved to be essential. It would not have been possible for the British to do that on their own. And I think that's the key takeaway from this. They're different strategic powers, but they are rivals in the same regions. The British want to open up the Ottoman Empire and Central Asia to trade. The Russians want to take it over and control the trade and push it through St. Petersburg. And so there's a cultural, there's an economic, and there's a political rivalry there.
Right, absolutely. And we have two questions coming in from Roger Higginson and Tim, asking about some of the lessons we might learn, unsurprisingly, for our strategic confrontation with Russia today. What would you say the most transferable lessons are?
Yeah, I think the great thing about history is it gives us a brilliant opportunity to think about the past and to see if the past can throw up any ideas that we can then develop. The past isn't going to tell us what to do. The world is a different place across the last 180 years. A great deal has changed. But if we have the wrong understanding of history, if we carry on with the old Crimean War of the Charge and Florence Nightingale, which is invariably reflected in most conventional histories of the 19th century as a bit of a disaster, something of a failure. Words like catastrophe appear in most histories of Britain's Crimean War. This is just simply irrelevant to the outcome of the conflict. Yes, mistakes were made. It was unusual for a war not to involve large mistakes, and lessons were learned. But the lessons on the Russian side were far greater than those on the British. The Russians lost this war. They lost it very badly, and they were not a great power again for the next 30 years. And I think that's a point we need to reflect on. If the West wants to turn the current crisis into a seriously positive result, they need to make sure that the current Russian regime is not carrying on, and they need to make sure that the West is in a better position to deal with this kind of aggression going forward. And I see the enlargement of NATO as a fairly obvious mechanism for that. The willingness of formerly neutral countries to join suggests that the security environment is now very different, and we need to profit from that. Sweden moved from being a Russian stooge to being a Western ally in the course of the Crimean War. That's a critical development. And it really does reshape the Baltic as a strategic theater. The Baltic now becomes primarily Western rather than Russian. So those are the kind of things we can pick out of this, the big long-term issues, and we can minimize that focus on battle casualties.
Right, absolutely. So we've got a question coming in from Duncan Stradling about some of the cultural roots of sea blindness, things like Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. What do you think the reasons are, given given that Britain is actually, as you've very eloquently described in your work, a maritime culture in many ways? Why do you think that land warfare still becomes consecrated in the popular imaginary in a way that is not?
There is a kind of normative behavior. So people live on land, they live in landed communities, they travel on land, they view the sea, but they don't live there. Even sailors don't live on the sea. A maritime identity is a constructed identity. It's not natural identity. And as a result, it's hard work to keep it up. You need very skillful literateurs, you need skillful artists. If you look at the early Victorians, the late Regency period, you look at people like Turner, you look at John Ruskin, these people are consciously creating maritime culture. They're developing an understanding of Britain being distinct, being part of a maritime line of succession, but a distinctly different culture to other states. And they explain how it works in their different languages. And that's part of a massive positive effort. And what happens after 1945 is we stop telling ourselves those old stories. We stopped telling the great stories about why Britain was maritime and different. It doesn't matter whether they're true, they're great stories and they create an identity. Much of the nationalist rhetoric of every state on earth is untrue and unsafe, but it's there for a purpose. Creating identity, creating culture, these are very important things. When you have a state, when you have the leaders of the state, be they monarchs or statesmen, you have the cultural creators moving in that direction. And you see that really powerfully in the Napoleonic Wars. Britain creates a freestanding maritime culture, which is outside Europe. That's what Turner's art is all about. He's saying, we need to look at ourselves. We are of the sea. We are not of the continent. And much of the post-war writing is reflecting that. Even German philosophers understand that the British are different. Johan Herder says, look, the British are just Germans, but they live on an island and they've become much more adventurous as a result. That's perfect. That's a wonderful way of explaining, British exceptionalism. But it does have to be created and it has to be sustained. But those of us who were around in 1982, which is when I was finishing my original work on the Crimean War, will remember that the Falkland Islands suddenly reversed the polarity. That long drift into continental normality was all of a sudden the switch was flicked and everybody was at sea. Everybody was heart and soul behind the task force. We became a maritime nation in about 25 minutes. Yeah. And when the Sheffield was hit, we all realized that it wasn't just glorious and successful, there were going to be casualties too. So that's, those kind of events change the way we see the world. But we've had too many long drawn out campaigns where the fighting has been on land because there are no significant maritime opponents in recent wars. And we've tended to normalize that activity. And we have to understand that that is the exception. We are not a continental power, because if we were, we would be a remarkably small and insignificant one. British strategy has to be maritime. That's not naval, but maritime. We have to focus on the places we have to be strong, which is at sea, because otherwise we will not amount to very much. So and that's what the Crimean War emphasizes. The British didn't mobilize a mass army to fight the Russians. They borrowed the French army instead, much cheaper. They hired the Sardinian army to fight for them as well. We paid the Sardinians to go to the Crimea and fight. So if you're in Turin, they have a Crimean War memorial as well. And all of their men died of disease too. So you create a culture and you have to sustain it. It's not a once and for all, it's forever. If you read Shakespeare, there's not a page without a maritime reference on it, because he's working in the Pool of London and half his audience are sailors. That's the kind of environment that you need to create to generate that shift from being medieval England, which is a continental stay-at-home state, to early modern England, which is a maritime expansive state. That's consciously created. It's not accidental, and it's certainly not random.
Absolutely. And to move from the sort of strategic down to some of the more tactical details of the conflict and perhaps some of the lessons we can draw. The old adage of a ship's fool to fight a fort is somewhat disproven in this conflict, but as one of our audience members points out, is proven again in other conflicts, the American Civil War, for example. What's unique about this conflict? Why does naval power overcome land-based fortifications the way it does?
The key to the naval success in bombardment operations in this war is a very long-running effort to increase the range and accuracy of gunfire from the sea. The target is almost always Cherbourg. It's necessary to fire at least 3,300 yards to use a small gunboat with a large gun to bombard the French dockyard. The Navy is planning this from the late 1830s. The naval gunnery training ship HMS Excellent is conducting the trials. And the new 68-pounder gun that I showed on one of the slides, it was purpose-built for long-range fire, because 18th century cannon do not like being fired at high elevation. They tend to break. So these 19th century cannon look remarkably similar. They're just big cast iron tubes, but they are much, much stronger, and they can fire at very long range. And by the beginning of this war, the Royal Navy is also using heavy rifled cannon, which give remarkable accuracy out to nearly 5,000 yards. So they can outrange the shore defenses, because the Russians do not have cannon of that quality or of that range. They don't have rifled cannon. They don't have super heavy cannon. British also using heavy mortars, and they're also using improved rockets. So they have three major bombardment technologies, all of which give them long range. So they can project a lot of fire without taking casualties. That's very different to what you see in most ships versus forts engagements. The ships are forced to go where the forts want them to be and are at a disadvantage. In this war, the ships are able to overpower the forts by superior mobility and superior range of fire. So yes, this isn't absolutely normal, but if you assemble enough naval firepower, you can overcome any shore defenses, as D-Day demonstrated.
So we've talked a lot about, the virtues of the maritime approach to strategy, but I was taken by something you mentioned, the idea of Crimea being a strategic raid that becomes a bit of a morass. And, there are parallels perhaps with Gallipoli and in a similar light. Are maritime powers perhaps drawn to the idea of like an indirect approach, a silver bullet that sometimes draws them into engagements that they're better placed not fighting? Is that a historical trend?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And we can go back to the Athenian invasion of Syracuse in the Peloponnesian War, a classic overextension of maritime dominion and turning it into a continental catastrophe. The Athenians at least only reinforced their catastrophe once. The British reinforced the Western Front for the entire First World War. The problem is that the need to secure command of the sea is overwhelming. It is absolutely essential, and therefore taking risks to enhance command of the sea is normal for maritime powers. It's not normal for continental powers, which are very reluctant to use their navies at all. And that means you have to rely on the grand raid style operation. It has to be an operation at pace. It has to be done quickly or not at all. And if things go wrong, everything falls to pieces. The British and French were in a position to capture Sevastopol on the 17th of October, 1854, less than 4 weeks after landing in the Crimea, more than 100 miles away from the position. And but for the failure of the French artillery bombardment on that day, they would almost certainly have captured the city. So they came very, very close. But you have to give the Russians the credit for putting up a very stout defense, as they would do in the Second World War, defending the same city against another invading army. So there's always a risk. And if you look at the history of British amphibious operations against naval bases, it is patchy. But the risk is less important than the necessity of the consequences. And it's also essential to maintain the initiative. If you simply sit back commanding the sea and defending your position, the enemy will be able to disperse their resources and do things like attack your maritime trade. If we look at the First World War, German U-boats are in the Atlantic sinking British merchant ships because the British are not in the Baltic attacking the German coast. That's what the submarines were for. They were defensive assets. They got repurposed because the British did not seize the initiative in German coastal waters. So it's a critical balance. Where do you draw the line? Where do you put that effort? And the British focus is always going to be on sink the fleet, destroy the dockyard, dominate the sea, impose economic warfare, break the enemy's economy. And that relies on having a very strong economy of your own, which historically the British had down to the First World War. A dominant fleet with a superior fighting capability, which again they had, and getting your hands on soldiers mostly by hiring or by alliance. In the Crimean War, the British raised 3 large regiments of mercenaries. They don't conscript anybody. they have a hard job keeping the army up to strengthen the Crimea, because that's not important. The sea is important. And losing sight of that upsets the balance of maritime strategy and leads to much more serious problems in the 20th century.
No, absolutely. And I just want to touch on something you raised there, the critical element of maritime strategy, economic warfare. How, I suppose, as one of Russia's largest markets and commanding the market power it does, what stops Britain from using, I suppose, some of the non-kinetic means that would be used to choke off a nation's trade today, sanctions being the obvious example? And going forward, if I could ask a broader question, what do you see the naval role in economic warfare being? Do you see it being superseded by other means, or do you see it still retained?
I think we have to be clear that economic blockade is largely a commercial and legal matter. The Great Blockade of Germany in the First World War is conducted in the law courts. The British government is using highly confidential transcripts of intelligence, which is decrypted, in order to convict neutral merchant ships of breaking the blockade. It's not using ships to chase these vessels down. The ship seizing blockade runner thing is marginal. And it's the same in this war. The British government tells everybody, do not buy anything from Russia. Don't lend the Russians any money. They tell the Dutch not to lend the Russians any money because the Dutch have to listen to the British in financial terms. So Russia has no outlets. It has nowhere it can sell. It has nowhere it can raise capital. And eventually it very quickly runs out. Russia in the 19th, 20th century is an economy that is very, very short of capital. It's a hand-to-mouth economy. Russian state revenues are whatever the Russians have earned the previous year. So in 1855, the Russians are fighting on the money that the British paid them in 1853 for export goods. There is no 1855 income. And so by the end of the campaign, the Russians have run out of money. So sanctions, economic warfare, they're all part of the same spectrum. They're all legal instruments. And this is why Julian Corbett is the obvious strategist for Britain, because he's a lawyer and he understands that the basis of all of this is the law. And having a legal regime, which the British fought for quite hard, that enables you to conduct maritime economic warfare at a high level is critical to your strategic strength. It doesn't matter how big the Royal Navy's battle fleet is, if it can't conduct maritime economic warfare under its own terms, it is ineffective. Britain's great power status depended on the legal regime allowing it to operate at sea, to destroy hostile economies, and that in turn depended on having a large battle fleet. But without the legal basis for that operation, the battle fleet would have been able to do no more than fight the enemy's fleet, which is strategically irrelevant. Commanding the sea is about turning that to your advantage. You command it so you can control it and deny it to the enemy for operations of war, but primarily for economic activity. So that's the basis of everything here. And the big debates in British government about this war are legal debates. They're not military or strategic.
Right. And on that subject of, a maritime strategy sort of combining economic suasion, a fairly slow but steady pressure on, you might say, the softer elements of an autocratic society and limited aims on land. I suppose I'd have a question of how close does Britain come? Because Palmerston during periods is pushing for a much more expansive set of objectives than Britain eventually sees. How close does Britain come, in your opinion, from deviating from this strategy?
Yeah, Palmerston is fascinating because he spent all of his adult life in government. He became a junior minister in 1807. He was the last living cabinet minister who'd shaken Nelson's hand. And he does talk in very expansive terms about driving Russia back to the position that it was in before Catherine the Great. So no Crimea, large parts of the Caucasus, Poland, Finland, pushing the Russians well back towards the east. Putin's nightmare, Russia being excluded from Europe and driven back and weakened on that basis. this is a negotiating position. These things will all be very nice, but they do presuppose that Russia has utterly collapsed and is incapable of defending itself. And as he didn't try to raise an army to make that happen, one has to think that this is a bargaining chip, not a real set of objectives. So he's talking about this in public. And again, that's part of the diplomacy of war. We're watching it every day now. The West says we're sending the Ukrainians some new weapons, and Putin says, well, I'll fire my weapons further into the Ukraine in response to that. You know, we're waging war in the pages of the Times. In those days, it's a bit quicker now, but it's the same thing. The London Times is a platform across which the war is being waged in words. Palmerston is using that to hold the cabinet together. He's using it to secure the funding he needs to finish the war. And as soon as the Russians are in a position where they're going to surrender, he's perfectly content to accept a limited victory, because the cost of fighting this to a finish and utterly defeating Russia was something that no British statesman in the 1850s would have contemplated. Remember, this is a country that's turned its national debt from a problem into an awful sense of impending doom. By 1815, the British national debt is 200% of GDP, and they spend the whole of the 19th century trying to get it under control. So fighting an endless war with Russia was really very unattractive. Fighting a limited war with Russia, driving Russia back from Ottoman Turkey, pushing the Russians back in the Baltic, weakening their grip on the Northern Ocean and in the Pacific, this is a big result for the British. Russia is not a strategic threat to the British Empire until the turn of the 20th century. And that, I think, is what Palmerston wanted. I think everything else was a degree of rhetoric. The idea that Poland would be liberated, as Palmerston pointed out in 1863, Poland rose in revolt. He pointed out they were 7 years too late. If they'd risen up in revolt during the Crimean War, they would have been British and French support. But there wasn't going to be any of that in 1863. So it's timing, it's opportunism, and it's having a big plan, but not being obsessed with carrying it through to effect. We're looking at statesmen who make big plans and don't understand why they don't work, certainly in Moscow at the moment. Palmerston isn't one of those. He's a pragmatist, and he understands Britain's strengths and its weaknesses, and he's prepared to work those strengths, to tolerate the weaknesses, to achieve what is a really important result. And remember, at the peace conference in Paris, where fairly moderate terms are imposed on Russia, the one thing the British get is a new legal dispensation that abolishes privateering, which was the primary threat to British merchant shipping. The Americans start this process, not intending to achieve that result. The British outmaneuver them, and by 1856, American strategy, which is privateering, has just been destroyed. The Russians won't use it, they've signed the treaty. The French won't use it, they've signed the treaty. The Americans probably will, but they will now be international pariahs. And when the South in the American Civil War tries to go privateering, everybody closes their ports to them and they have to give it up. So the British changed that legal balance in their favor around the margins of that meeting, much as they secure the ability to conduct blockade in 1919 at Versailles. Most important battle of the First World War is a verbal altercation between the American president and the British Prime Minister over maritime legal rights.
Right, absolutely. And just a final question before we wrap it up. Several people have asked this. If you were to draw some broad lessons about not so much the strategic sort of approach to Russia, but how the Royal Navy should be employed today as a strategic tool, what would you say they are? What sort of immutable lessons could we transfer?
Yeah, the ultimate lesson of this war is that a state like Britain, which is not quite unique, but it's fairly unique, needs to have a strategy which emphasizes the maritime domain. This is not naval strategy. Naval strategy is something that any country with a fleet can operate. Russia has a naval strategy. America has a naval strategy. Britain has a maritime strategy. Britain's senior service is the Navy, and everything needs to coalesce around the maritime domain, because that's where Britain has to be strong. That's where Britain has historically been strong. And that has been the basis of British success. Losing control of the sea would be catastrophic. Most of the continental territory British soldiers have walked on in the last 300 years is not very important. For 300 years, the only bit of the world that really mattered strategically to the British was northern Flanders, because that's the only place you can invade England from with sailing ships. That's why the British were constantly fighting battles in Belgium. That's why the British created the modern Low Countries in 1815. That's why Napoleon marched up to Waterloo. He was getting onto the Scheldt estuary because that's how you threaten the British. So it's picking your targets. It's understanding that the middle of the Eurasian landmass is not a place where Britain can exercise any power, and we shouldn't be thinking about exercising power there. Britain has historically been very effective exercising power in the maritime domain, because if you destroy the economy of a state like Russia, you don't have to fight them outside Moscow. They will surrender anyway. The war that I'd like to finish with, because nobody mentions this one at all, is the Anglo-Russian War in the middle of the Napoleonic conflict. Between 1807 and 1811, the Royal Navy's biggest fleet is in the Baltic. It's conducting a sustained blockade of Russia. By 1811, the Russian economy has collapsed and the Russians have abandoned their part in Napoleon's continental system. And to try and put them back into that system, Napoleon will invade Russia. The Russians would rather fight Napoleon on the battlefield than fight the British in a war in which nobody's getting killed. This is not a kinetic war. It's an economic war. It's waged without any significant fighting. And it's a war the British win. And that is the turning point of the entire Napoleonic conflict. So if you prefer your Napoleonic conflicts to turn on mass casualty events, you can always look at Borodino. But the Russians didn't go to Borodino by choice. They went because they'd run out of money. And the Russian Tsar understood that if the economy collapsed, the empire would collapse with it. And he would probably share his father's fate and be murdered by disappointed landowners. So Russia has a long history of economic weakness being exploited. And going forward, we need to reinforce those levers and make sure they are more effective. The biggest threat to maritime strategy is the ability of states like China, Russia, and to an extent the United States to turn the maritime space into effectively offshore continental territory. And that's the thing to resist, this creeping continentalization of the maritime domain, the attempt to impose control over large sea areas. What Mahan referred to as the great global commons need to remain common and open. And that, I think, is a big task for British diplomacy going forward, because otherwise maritime strategy will be crippled.
Absolutely. And well, with that, we are coming to time. But Andrew, I want to thank you for delivering another magisterial lecture. I really appreciate you making the time to do this, as do all of us at RUSI. I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience, both for attending and for your insightful questions throughout. I hope to see you at future RUSI military history events, including our next one, which will be on the 23rd of June at 1600, where our own Andrew Young will discuss the inception of British amphibious doctrine during the 7 Years' War. With that, a digital round of applause for our speaker. I hope to see you.
Thank you very much. And I can recommend Andrew Young's paper.